Welcome back to A People's Guide to Publishing. I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing and Distribution. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 25 years.
I'm Ellie Blue. I'm the editorial and marketing director here at Microcosm. We are an independent mid-list publisher based in Portland, Oregon. We have 14 employees, over 650 titles in print with 20 to 40 new books per year, and we distribute thousands of titles from other publishers.
We started this podcast so that we can share what we've learned with newer publishers so that you can learn from our mistakes.
Or maybe you just want to understand the publishing industry.
I forgot to put on a clean hat this morning.
How dare you?
Storing
Podcast is ruined.
Sorry, podcast. Same old hat. Different day.
Today, this week, we are going to talk about some current events in publishing. Some breaking news. And we could not get the desk of Connie Chung for us to talk across, very unfortunately.
We do need a green screen in here, though. Can you imagine all of the things we could do with that?
We'll have to get the production department on this immediately. But instead, we will just talk to you about these news items. And one of the big ones was that Ingram Publisher Services has, I guess we can start at the beginning of the story. So, when Ingram bought Perseus Publishing Group in, I believe, 2015? Yes, I believe 2015. One of the arguments for what they were going to do was they were going to put all the books from all of those publishers into, their Ingram warehouses, and that they would have I believe the term was synchronized inventory. So, which, under the auspices of greater availability, that you would be able to, be a bookstore in New York City, and then you'd be able to order the book from the Ingram warehouse in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, rather than having to wait for it to ship from Tennessee, and you would have next day availability. And next day availability is perhaps as a byproduct of the Amazonian world we live in, something that basically everybody expects nowadays.
So Ingram went from having one giant warehouse in Tennessee to 5 warehouses all over the country? Is that...
Ingram had 4 warehouses and then bought a 5th.
Oh, okay.
Ingram being the centralized wholesaler for... the only, I guess, nationalized book wholesaler in the United States. So, essentially, when you are a bookstore, you have a local Ingram warehouse where you can order that book from, assuming it's in stock, and it will arrive the next day for just about the lower 48.
Got it. So Ingram having a ton of warehouses wasn't new. The new thing was Ingram servicing the publishers that they are a distributor for, not just a wholesaler for.
Correct.
Okay.
Ingram bought Perseus Books Group, who owned Consortium Publishers Group West. What was called Perseus Distribution is now called Two Rivers Distribution, as to not confuse with the Perseus Books Group, which is a publishing imprint that is owned by Hachette. And now I probably have confused you.
I'm confused.
And then I want to say there's one more in there. But point being, so all of those and then, was once Legato. And then all those publisher groups became IPS, which was Ingram Publisher Services, which became essentially different from Ingram's wholesale business, but Ingram's Publisher Services business.
Can we just back up a sec and explain the difference between, say you're a small publisher listening to this podcast and you're like, my book's available through Ingram.
I think they've all fallen asleep and or have passed out and hit their head from dizziness.
I mean, but that could mean 2 things. Your book could be listed in the Ingram wholesale catalog.
Yes.
Or you could be part of Ingram's full service distribution program, IPS.
Correct.
Which is a very different kettle of fish.
Yeah. So Ingram Wholesale is a passive sales fulfillment mechanism, meaning when you are sold in Ingram warehouses, that means you have existing demand that they are fulfilling. So you are the one that have established the buzz and the marketing and the sales, and then they are supporting you in fulfilling those orders from their warehouses.
Got it. And they order from their regional warehouses based on the orders they get from stores in those regions, right?
Or just, yeah, needing to restock. Yes, yeah, that's correct. I mean, and in theory, once you've shown a track record, then Ingram will just, you'll say, I have a new book, and Ingram will say, okay, the last book by this author sold this many, so it makes sense to get this distribution in these warehouses.
So it was a big deal when Ingram was offering that same service to publisher clients.
Correct. Seemingly. Like, that seems like it would be a really good deal.
So what happened? What's the breaking news?
So, Ingram declared that, or I should say announced, that at the end, they're finishing an 18-month cycle of saying that that didn't work to have all of those Publisher Services clients' books available in all of their warehouses in synchronized inventory. And we were with PGW at the beginning of that cycle when, we watched the transition into that system. So it's interesting, and because I feel like it speaks to the biggest phenomenon that I see in publishing, which is the fact that the bestseller is dead. Like the age of the bestseller is over. And meaning, every book sells more or less, not an even keel, but the spikes and aberrations are much less common.
So before we get to the analysis, so they said that the multiple warehouses didn't work for their distribution clients, and so now...
Yeah, it was just a fulfillment nightmare because they can't have, I guess, yeah, maybe I didn't articulate that well enough. So the problem is that, Ingram represents more or less the 15 million books that are in print that are actively selling at any given time. And on top of that, the idea would be that most of those would come from their client publishers. However, it's just impossible to hold inventory in 5 warehouses of 15 million titles simultaneously and or well. I can tell you that doing it for 14,000 titles is really a nightmare.
Yeah, in 2 warehouses,
and
or even in 1.
Less than 0.1% as many. And so, yes.
So they decided to consolidate all of their IPS clients' stock into...
They were going to go back to the warehouse that they started from in Tennessee.
But they're keeping their other warehouses open for their wholesale business, right?
Yes, that's correct. So it'll be an interesting, and I guess that's sort of the thing where, you just can't be, it was an ambitious and cool idea, but, it's just... and the problem you run into is you're like, okay, a store orders 7 titles, and you're like, okay, this one's in this warehouse, and this one is in this warehouse.
Right.
And then you're like, you are the one that has to eat it on shipping all of those.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they decided that didn't make sense anymore.
Which is very reasonable. So what does this mean for the industry?
So, it's the same old story of what it usually comes down to. It means there are so many books, and you just don't have the number of, flyaway bestsellers that you did, say, in the 80s or even in the 90s. And the result of that is that people have to, publishers have to make quite a few more books to make their numbers work. And then with quite a few more books, and the average book nowadays selling a mere 2,000 copies, that's a lot of books to juggle 79 copies or 16 copies or,
Right, yes.
And I feel like it's just indicative of the way that publishers are scrambling to cope with the, democratic nature of sales nowadays, where even a book by, a former best-selling author is now, selling on par with a debut author,
Right, so it makes sense to have them all in one location.
Yeah. One gigantic warehouse. And, and so and that was interesting to me because of all of those reasons, even though that ultimately will make life more difficult for the bookstores and probably hurt sales for the publishers. It was just it's indicative of the problem that Amazon ultimately caused, in my opinion.
Which is?
That, by forcing down the sales of every book through just flooding the market with books that the consumer just legitimately doesn't have time to figure out if they're good or bad.
Right.
It just hurts sales of all books, because you can't possibly know every science fiction book that's coming out, even if you own a science fiction themed bookstore.
Right.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub.
On Twitter at Microcosm.
On Facebook at Microcosm Publishing.
On Instagram at Microcosm_pub.
And here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.